I have the honor to present the next speaker, who is Professor Sajadur Rahman. He is currently working as a consultant neonatologist and clinical director of NICU in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He has a wealth of experience in his field and has also authored 2 books. He will share his knowledge regarding the update on neonatal bacterial meningitis. Please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Dr. Akmali, Dr. Zishan, and Dr. Tipu Sultan, and the organizers. We'll get on to the talk, and I chose this neonatal meningitis instead of the original topic of CNS infections because that is very difficult to cover. This is something which we need to understand because this is our day-to-day practice. And this is going to be a clinical presentation. And as Professor Sahil Maqbool was saying that we have got a lot of limitations over here. So we're not going to talk a lot about the theoretical things which we cannot do. Let's talk about the things which we can do and which we should be doing and which can benefit the newborn babies in Pakistan on our day-to-day practice. So we have a number of challenges when we think of meningitis and sepsis. And for all practical purposes, in most of the cases, it is difficult to differentiate sepsis from meningitis. Whether there is sepsis alone, or there is sepsis with meningitis, or there is only meningitis without sepsis. So it's a difficult clinical question, and there is no hard and fast answer to it. Now, one of the important challenges in neonatal sepsis and meningitis is the changing epidemiology. What causes sepsis? What causes meningitis? This has been changing over a period of time. That's what we call the temporal change in the organisms which cause this sepsis. But apart from this temporal change, there is a regional change. Every region has got its own organisms. Every region has got its own sensitivity patterns. And even within the same city, say Lahore, many hospitals will have different antibiograms and they will have different set of organisms causing meningitis. Maybe the population they are draining has different social circumstances. So this has been a big challenge, and therefore we need to keep an eye on the epidemiology. Now, when we talk about the sepsis, we always talk about the early neonatal sepsis, which is in the first 3 days of life, first 72 hours of life, and then the late onset sepsis, which is in the next 27 days of life, and then very late onset sepsis if the babies stay in the NICU for a longer period of time. Now, this is a perinatally acquired infection, and you can see this forms only 1.5% of the total sepsis. This is a little bit smaller part of the sepsis. The bigger part of the sepsis which happens in the NICU is the late onset sepsis, which is acquired from the NICU itself. It is a hospital acquired infection. And the organisms are different. These are organisms coming from the birth canal, vertical transmission. This is horizontal transmission, the transmission which is coming from the environment, from the staff, from all of us who can transmit it, from the equipment and from the material we used to take care of these babies. And you know, some of these babies, particularly preterm babies, may be staying in the NICU for weeks and for months. So they are our guests for a long period of time, and we can introduce infection in them. So we need to understand. But the most important thing is that the organisms which cause this sepsis, early and late sepsis, are different. So if they are different, the approach to treatment has to be different. So we need to differentiate between that. Now, what has been causing the sepsis? Changes in pathogens causing early onset neonatal sepsis in very low birth weight infants. This is one of the studies showing how the organisms have changed between 1991 to 93, and then again at late 1990s, when the group B streptococcus was the most common organism in the beginning, but then it decreased, and this decrease is significant statistically. And this was because of the introduction of what we call the intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis, which we give to the mothers before delivery. And of course, the screening for the GBS as well. So the pattern has changed over a period of 10 years' time. And at the same time, the E. coli have increased. This is the data from the United States, which may not as such apply to the situation in Pakistan. But what it signifies is that the organisms do change with practice and with time. Now, early onset sepsis, how it affects the developed countries. What are the common organisms? They still do have the group B streptococcus. This is the United States data. And the second commonest organism is the E. coli and the other gram-negative organisms. So their problem is vertically transmitted gram-positive organism, the group B streptococcus. For the late onset sepsis, in developed countries, Coagulase negative staph is the commonest organism which we all see in our NICUs and probably maybe in this part of the world as well. And this is a opportunistic organism which has got low pathogenicity and it is acquired from the NICU and it is the major cause of the late onset sepsis. And then comes the gram-negative organisms and Klebsiella and E. coli, which are the most common. Some units do get a lot of Staph aureus as well. Now, this is common organisms in the developing countries. Here we have different. If it is the delivery room acquired infections, the commonest organisms which we are dealing over here are the Klebsiella species. Of course, GBS is not a big problem over here. Our big problem is the gram-negative sepsis and commonest is the Klebsiella. Some units do report Staph aureus as well. The coagulase negative staph is much less as a problem as compared to the developed world countries. Now, this is the common organisms acquired from the community because you get a lot of admissions from outside as well. And here you can have staph as one of the important organisms in addition to the Klebsiella. So both gram-negative and gram-positive. So knowing the organism is important when you decide what antibiotics should I use to treat them. This is about the sepsis. Now the diagnosis and of the neonatal sepsis and meningitis is a very big challenge. It's a clinical challenge. And what we say for all practical purposes, sepsis and meningitis is a clinical diagnosis. And I second the opinion of Dr. Saris Maghul that we should do a good clinical examination. And your clinical examination should tell you whether you are dealing with sepsis or sepsis and meningitis. But again, there are no hard and fast rules in the neonate in the diagnosis of meningitis. The clinical features could be quite subtle and deceiving. Therefore, we have to keep a high level of suspicion in our mind. Now, how do you confirm the diagnosis of meningitis? Is CSF examination. And again, in the CSF examination, the most important thing is the culture. So blood culture, CSF culture is very important, but the culture positivity rate in newborns is low, only about 15 to 25%. Most of the sepsis which we treat is culture negative sepsis. So there have to be some other kind of parameters other than the sepsis, other than the culture itself, which can help us make a clinical decision whether this baby has sepsis and meningitis or it does not have, and if it does have, whether we need to treat it or we do not need to treat it. So we take a lot of help from the biochemical markers, apart from doing the routine WC count and platelet counts. We also take a lot of help from the various kinds of biomarkers which have become now available. And the most important of these are the CRP and the procalcitonin. This is a very important diagram, and I like the trainees to keep this in mind. Well, of course, we don't need to get worried about a number of these biochemical markers like T1 necrosis factors, interleukin 10, interleukin 6. The two which are most commonly used are the CRP, C-reactive protein, and the procalcitonin, which has recently been introduced. Now, again, we need to know how the CRP works and how the CRP rises. This is the normal curve from the time of infection how the CRP rises. So CRP is not a very useful test till the 12 hours of life after the sepsis starts. And then it peaks at about 24 to 48 hours. So if you check early CRP, it may not be helpful. It may be normal, but that normal CRP does not exclude sepsis or meningitis. It can be used later on. If you do another test at 12 hours or 24 hours of age, then you might be able to get a positive result. Procalcitonin is a little bit better because it rises early. Within 2 hours of sepsis, it can start rising. By between 6 to 10 hours, it peaks. And usually what we do is we do them together. A combined result of CRP and PCT is more helpful than any one of them alone. So these two tests can help us a lot in diagnosing and managing sepsis and meningitis. So meningitis itself is a very big challenge. How common is meningitis? Well, the figures vary from various centers to centers. And in the developed world, it can be anything from 0.3 per 1,000 to 0.5 per 1,000, particularly the HSV meningitis, which we are otherwise able to differentiate from the normal meningitis, the bacterial meningitis. The incidence is higher in various developing countries, even if they are economically well. How much this contributes to under 5 mortality? It's this biggest problem. This is the WHO data. This is the global study data. And you can see it's the second or the third commonest cause of under 5 mortality. And this, the purple one, is the meningitis, which forms almost 1/3 to half of the cases of neonatal sepsis. So maybe half of the cases may have meningitis when they present to us with sepsis. This was the data which I got from one of the articles published from Central Punjab, and they tried to find how many cases of meningitis did they find in various age group infants. And you can see the highest incidence is in the newborn period. So neonatal meningitis, well, it's relatively a bit uncommon as compared to the sepsis as such, but it's important because the outcome is very bad if it is not recognized and treated in time. So it is an infection which has high mortality, and even if the babies survive, the morbidity is high, and this is particularly true in low and middle income countries due to limited resources. So what is the morbidity outcome of those who survive because of neonatal meningitis? 25 to 50% have significant problems with the language. So they may not do well later in life when they grow and develop. They may have problem with the motor function, hearing, vision, and cognition. 5 to 20% have future epilepsy. And there's a high risk of subtle problems, and 20% have educational difficulties. So I'm not sure how good we are in following these children on a long-term basis in a developing country. Probably we don't have much data, but if we do follow, then we can find that a lot of these have got a significant morbidity later in life. Now, why do the newborns are so much susceptible to mortality and morbidity, neurological morbidity because of sepsis? There are a lot of reasons for that. Of course, prematurity is one of the big reasons. And because of prematurity per se and the deficient immunological responses and defense systems of the body, and of course, so these various stages of developing brain, which we learned yesterday from the presentation of Professor Huck, the more premature is the baby, the more he is likely to have neurological problem. So they are very high risk patients for developing a morbidity, neurological morbidity because of sepsis and meningitis. The inefficient alternative complementary pathway, compromised T cell and B cell defenses, deficient migration and phagocytosis by neutrophils, and of course, our own interventions, the intensive care interventions. All these babies have got lines, peripheral lines, central lines, UBCs, USCs, endotracheal tubes, urinary catheters, all around they are invaded. So we keep on breaking the barriers, the skin barrier as well as the mucosal barriers. So therefore, they are at a very high risk of invasion of organisms into the body. Now, when the neonate with meningitis develops seizures, that means the risk of neurological disability is higher. So seizures lasting longer than 72 hours and the need for inotropes predict moderate to severe disability or death with 88% sensitivity and 99% specificity. So how sick is the baby? Well, you can judge that, how much inotropes he needs to maintain the normal blood pressure and normal circulation. And if he's seizing at all, then the risk of his having neurological problems is very high. It's a very bad prognostic sign. Now, when we go to the meningitis specifically, I have mentioned the organisms in sepsis in general. But if you look specifically on meningitis, what causes meningitis in the developed world in newborn babies? The commonest organism in about 50% of the cases is group Streptococcus. Then the next comes E. coli, and the third one is the Listeria monocytogenes. And I'm not sure how many Listeria we see over here. But these two organisms are very dangerous, quite dreadful outcomes, both with GBS as well as Listeria meningitis. The problem is that GBS, it can cross the intact membranes. So you don't need to take into account whether the mother has prolonged rupture of membranes or does not have prolonged rupture of membranes. Even if she does not have any rupture of membranes and she has got a high vaginal swab positive for GBS, but the problem with the GBS is it's such an invasive organism, it can cross the intact membranes and cause neonatal sepsis and meningitis. So you must be aware of it. Now the second problem is with the Listeria. Listeria is the only organism which crosses placenta. So if the mother gets Listeria through the food she takes and it goes into her circulation, it can immediately cross the placenta and produce neonatal sepsis and meningitis. And that is a very devastating infection. In the developing world, we don't see much of the GBS. So our main problem is the gram-negative sepsis, Klebsiella, E. coli, and probably Staph aureus, which has been mostly reported in South American data. And I'm not sure what the exact data from Pakistan is. Probably it's the same thing as we're talking about from the other developing countries. So the two big problems are Klebsiella and E. coli. Now, one important thing is the herpes simplex meningitis in neonates. In the developed world, the people are very cautious about it. And I'm not sure how common it is in Pakistan, but this is one of the most devastating types of meningitis we have seen, and how it can lead to death as well as severe disability in newborn babies. So it's one of the most devastating types of neonatal meningitis. And 95% of neonatal herpes simplex virus infections result from intrapartum transmission. So it's a vertical transmission, and most of these are the early onset type of meningitis. The mortality is quite high, about 15%, irrespective whether it's type 1 HSV or type 2 HSV. 25 to 40% of neonatal HSV is associated with meningitis. So the risk of meningitis is quite high. So again, comes to the clinical examination, both of the mother as well as of the newborn baby, in terms of looking for the vesicles and other signs of the herpes. Now, the risk of neurological morbidity is very high. Cerebral palsy, mental retardation, seizures, microcephaly, and ophthalmic defects. The risk of neurological morbidity remains 50% in spite of effective treatment with acyclovir, even if you start acyclovir in the very beginning. And this is the only treatment known for this herpes meningitis. So in spite of this, the outcome could be very bad. Now, there are some new emerging organisms which may not be relevant to what happens in Pakistan, the enteroviruses as well as the Enterobacter sakazaki, just mentioning it for the academic reasons. But the second organism is important because it is associated with milk formula contamination. So we have to be careful while dealing with these babies, and we have to take the history of their feeding as well. Now, we have learned a lot about the new ways we are trying to understand the meningitis. I'm not going to go into the details of all this and how the organisms they enter from the bloodstream. This is the blood vessel, and this is the endothelium. How they enter from the endothelium through the endothelium using various kinds of markers and the receptors, and they enter into the cells of the meninges. And once they enter into the cells of the tissues outside the blood vessels, how do they use various kinds of receptors to enter into the cells and produce changes? This might be very useful for us in future, where we are going to probably have some new interventions. How can we block these damaging effects of the organisms entering into the body? And then the new mechanisms by which the neutrophils and the other WBCs, they enter into the cells and produce protective effects, and how they are deficient in newborn babies, particularly in the preterm babies. Now again comes to the clinical presentation. Here we are going to deal with the babies most likely in a clinical way. That's more important. So signs and symptoms of neonatal meningitis are often subtle, making diagnosis difficult. That leads to morbidity. So we can be a little bit delayed. We can be in doubt. Is it meningitis? Is it non-meningitis? Should we treat? Should we not treat? This should use this antibiotic, use that antibiotic. And that ifs and buts can lead to delay, but they can lead to very serious morbidity. Now, two of the clinical features, stupor and irritability, they are the most common neurological signs in 75% of the cases. But neck rigidity and all these classical signs may not be present in the newborn babies. So we cannot be misled by this clinical examination. But again, stupor and irritability could be because of some other reasons as well, including the perinatal asphyxia. In stage 1 HI, the babies are very irritable, and it's very difficult to differentiate between asphyxia and meningitis, or asphyxia associated with meningitis. So fecal rigidity is the least common sign in neonatal bacterial meningitis, occurring in fewer than 25% of affected neonates. So neonatal meningitis clinical examination is quite different than infantile and the older child's examination of the yes. So what are the complications which we can enter into? The acute complications, cerebral edema. Hydrocephalus is very likely to happen up to probably 24% of the babies. Hemorrhage, ventriculitis, it happens particularly with the gram-negative bacteria, and that is very important because it determines how long should we treat the meningitis. We can have brain abscess and cerebral infarction, which can happen from anyone from 30 to 50% of the newborn babies having meningitis. And that is very important to keep in mind, because the more we delay the diagnosis and more we delay the treatment, the more are the chances of the adverse outcome. So chronic complications, the commonest is epilepsy. They can have long-term seizure disorders. They can have hearing loss, cognitive impairment, visual impairment, spastic paresis, and microcephaly. So how to diagnose? It's such a devastating disorder, such a common disorder, challenging situation on day-to-day basis. And every day we see these cases of sepsis and meningitis. And yesterday in my presentation, I said the same thing, that the three commonest disorders in the developing countries are the prematurity, asphyxia, and sepsis. And I showed you data from Pakistan. Over the last 20 years, nothing has changed. The same three disorders still remain the commonest problem in our neonatal units, in our neonatal practice. So what we do? Bacterial meningitis in neonates almost always occurs with sepsis, but it's difficult to distinguish clinically from sepsis alone. But for all practical purposes, it doesn't make much difference as well, because you have to treat, and the only thing you need to do is to change the dose of antibiotics and increase the duration of the antibiotics. And then of course you need to do some diagnostic investigations as well. Therefore, treatment is started on the basis of presumed infection rather than proven infection. So you suspect meningitis, you start treating it. Don't wait for any test. Even don't wait for CBC to come and tell you what's wrong with the CBC. Or even for the diagnostic test, I have told you about the CRP and procalcitonin. Well, you can take the test and send them to the lab, but don't wait for the lab to give you an answer and have to make the decision. As a clinician, as a bedside working person, it is your duty to start the treatment and go ahead. Prompt consideration of meningitis remains prudent whenever a neonate demonstrates even slight lethargy or irritability. These are the two commonest features of meningitis. Therefore, early intervention is the key. So it's a clinical diagnosis, it's a clinical intervention, it's a day-to-day matter. So don't wait for anything. You should be confident in that. If with a slightest suspicion, you should jump on it, you should treat it. Because the more you delay, the worse are the consequences. So what is the diagnostic approach and what can be the possible consequence? The most common reason for claims against pediatricians. So if the case goes to the court, the commonest reason the pediatricians are penalized is the bad neurological outcome. Every parent says, look, my child has got a neurological problem. It's all because of the fault of the pediatrician who failed to diagnose and manage the case in time. And among these, neonatal meningitis and sepsis is the second most frequent reason of malpractice rates. 46% of the paid claims by the insurance companies are paid because of meningitis and sepsis. So this is a very important legal issue as well, though it may not be very relevant to Pakistan, but of course, worldwide, it is a very important problem. So delayed diagnosis of neonatal meningitis is potentially a critical pitfall, and we should not get into this pitfall. So the basis of the diagnosis lies, of course, on the CSF examination. And the question is, should LP be done in all suspected cases of neonatal meningitis? Well, there is no consensus on that. Nobody can tell you in hard and fast that every case of sepsis, you should go for a lumbar puncture. Well, it is again a clinical diagnosis, a clinical suspicion. So there is no clear consensus. If there is sepsis with neurological symptoms, or if there's a gram-negative sepsis, or any gram-positive sepsis other than coagulase-negative staph sepsis, you should consider doing a lumbar puncture. And particularly if it is a late onset sepsis. The incidence of meningitis is much higher in late onset sepsis as compared to early onset sepsis. And coagulase-negative staph is, though it is the commonest organism causing late onset sepsis, but it is a bacteremia. Coagulase-negative staph rarely settles into organs and produces a localized infection. Therefore, the incidence of meningitis in coagulase-negative staph sepsis is very low. So you should not get worried about it. It's a bacteremia, it's a low pathogenic organism, it's a opportunistic organism. It makes the baby sick, but it doesn't kill the baby, and it doesn't lead to any long-term morbidities. But again, the question is, once you have done the lumbar puncture, you diagnose the meningitis. Should you repeat the lumbar puncture after 48 hours, or after 72 hours, or at the end of the treatment? There's no clear answer to it. If you talk to an ID consultant, he will say yes. If you talk to a neurosurgeon, he will say yes. At the end of 48 to 72 hours, you must repeat the lumbar puncture. Why should we repeat it? Because we want to make it sure that the CSF is now sterile, which means if you had grown something from the first culture and the second culture does not grow, this gives you a legal protection that we treated the meningitis in good time, and within 72 hours, the CSF was sterile. But most of the people, we do a repeat lumbar puncture if the meningitis is not resolving or the meningitis becomes complicated. But there's no clear answer for all these things. Now, when you do a CSF, what we normally do, this is a classic triad which we say in the CSF: decreased CSF glucose, elevated proteins, and dipleocytosis. How do you interpret? Again, it becomes a day-to-day problem because the results may not be very clear. Can you include or exclude meningitis by looking at the figures which you get from the laboratory as a result of the CSF examination? Now, the interpretation of CSF findings is more difficult in neonates than in older children. Normal values are a bit different. So only if all three parameters are normal does the LP provide evidence against infection. So if all these are normal, then you can say that this is not meningitis. So again, the number of cells in the WBCs varies with the gestational age. More premature babies normally may have a higher number because of the immaturity of the nervous system, and that may be a normal content. So that can lead us to a lot of confusion in the treatment of the meningitis. In herpes simplex virus, the presence of RBCs in the CSF is a very important marker. But again, we have to differentiate it that this was not a traumatic lumbar puncture. Now, CSF culture is mandatory if the child is symptomatic, and I'm sure this is one of the low-cost investigation which we can do. We try to get a culture if you can, and if it is possible, this will help you a lot. So with the exception of CSF culture, no single CSF value can be relied upon to exclude neonatal meningitis. So you have to then treat it. So 15 to 30% of infants with CSF proven meningitis will have negative blood culture, which means the meningitis can occur without culture positive sepsis itself. So the onus is on the clinician to justify initiation of antimicrobial and antiviral therapy regardless of the CSF values. That's what I have been stressing from the beginning. It's a clinical diagnosis, it's a clinical judgment, it's a bedside decision, and you have to make this decision very quickly, very early, and jump on the baby and start the treatment with the slightest suspicion of sepsis as well. Now, PCR assay is very important. It's becoming common. It's used most of the time for the herpes simplex virus and enteroviruses, but sometimes it can also be helpful in the diagnosis of GBS. And in neonates, PCR is 71 to 100% sensitive, and for HSV, and 98 to 99% so specific. So this is one test which can tell you that we are dealing with the herpes simplex virus. And I told you in the beginning, it's one of the most devastating meningitis, and in spite of very good early treatment with acyclovir, the morbidity remains very high. I'll just talk, if I have got 5 minutes, am I right? Yes, okay. Yeah, a few investigations, but some of them may not be very relevant to you. MRI is a very good investigation, but maybe because of the cost, and as Professor Sarid Maqbool was saying, the interpretation of MRI may not be as good as well. So it's very important. It can help us a lot in identifying many things. So indications for why should we do an MRI? When there are focal neurological abnormalities or persistent infection and clinical deterioration. We can have follow-up MRIs and follow-up MRS and other modalities of the same. Now, this is one of the MRI, T1 and T2 images, and you can see the lesions in the right frontal and left occipital lobe, as well as in the right occipital lobe as well, which are different in T1 and T2 images. The same in another view of the same patients. So it's preterm baby, and here you can see the hemorrhage in the ventricles along with the hydrocephalus which is developing. It's another full-term baby with meningitis, and you can see the enhanced meninges on the outer side, as well as the very prominent choroid plexus and the hydrocephalus. And here you can see what we call the pyocephalus. In the posterior horns, there is pus seen, and we can easily see that on the meninges. This actually indicates whether we need neurosurgical intervention or not, because these neurosurgical interventions are now becoming a part of the management of meningitis in the newborn babies. So CT scan is useful, but it exposes the newborn baby to a higher level of radiation, so we do not prefer it, though these neurosurgeons like it. And they are very happy to do it before they put the ventriculostomy drains or EVD, and it can be also helpful in following the diagnosis and management of brain abscess. Head ultrasound is very low risk, easily available bedside diagnosis, a tool which can be used by the neonatologist as well, but unfortunately it has a limited use. It does provide all the information which we need for the diagnosis and management of meningitis, but still it is worth doing in a low and middle income country. It is not mandatory. It is in seizures and non-responsive patients. But EEG actually is also a very good predictive tool. It can help to say how the baby is going to be on follow-up examination. So how do you manage neonatal meningitis? What is the update on that? So of course, it is the antimicrobial therapy. A confirmed diagnosis of meningitis is seldom established before treatment is started. And that's what I stressed from the beginning, that it is a presumed diagnosis. So when you suspect, you start the treatment. And early initiation of antibiotics is essential, and aggressive antimicrobial intervention is life-saving. So you have to have early intervention and aggressive intervention, and that's the way you can make a difference. The choice of antibiotics, nobody can tell you what to start and what not to start. And I said in the beginning, there is changing epidemiology. So you have to look at the antibiogram of your own hospital, your own institution, and you have to have an annual antibiogram, and you have to decide your own protocol based on that. But in general, early onset sepsis, most of the people would start with high dose ampicillin and gentamicin. Plus minus, some people will start with cefotaxime. Ampicillin, because it very well covers the group B streptococcus and it very well covers the Listeria monocytogenes. And gentamicin, you can use it. Some people use cefotaxime because it has got very good CSF penetration and it's very good in the treatment of meningitis. For late onset sepsis, to start with, most people will start with high dose meropenem and vancomycin because meropenem covers all gram negatives, most of the gram positive, as well as the anaerobic organisms. It's a very good antibiotic for empirical use. And vancomycin, because they're not sure whether this is coagulase negative staph or not. But once you are sure that this is not coagulase negative staph, then you can stop it. And then you can add to meropenem either amikacin or cefotaxime, particularly if the baby has gram-negative sepsis and there is a likelihood of ventriculitis. For ventriculitis, you do need 2 anti-gram-negative antibiotics. If you suspect HSV meningitis, always start acyclovir. Don't wait for the PCR, and even if you don't have the facility, your suspicion is enough to start the acyclovir. How long to treat? Usually people will treat for 14 to 21 days, particularly if it is gram-negative meningitis. And particularly if there is ventriculitis with meningitis, then we do definitely treat it for 21 days. And you should try to involve the infectious diseases consultant, though they have got a very different approach, but still they are very helpful. Corticosteroids, they are used in infants or older children, but corticosteroids has no role in the treatment of neonatal meningitis. Of course, you give all kind of intensive care therapy for the newborn, all kind of NICU care, as well as the support in terms of body fluids and nutrition. So seizures, most of the time, I think Dr. Irfan said that yesterday, our first choice remains phenobarbital, and the second one is phenytoin. Now, levetiracetam Keppra is taking over as second line, as well as sometimes first line as well. And the third lines are benzodiazepine. And whenever you need to use more than 2 anticonvulsants, try to involve the pediatric neurologist in the care. Hydrocephalus is quite common. I said it's one of the acute complications. So try to involve the pediatric neurosurgeon. And they are very fond of putting what we now call the EVD, the external ventricular drain, and it helps a lot. It not only drains the infected material from the ventricles, it helps in quick recovery as well as in the management and complications of hydrocephalus. So long is very important. And you may need to do a lot of tests on the follow-up of these examinations, which may not always be possible in a developing country. But if you have the opportunity, we must do that. But please remember that early intervention is the key to address developmental delay. These babies are at a very high risk of developmental delay, microcephaly, seizure disorders, and a lot of neurological morbidities. So we must interfere very in the developmental examination. So the take-home message from this presentation is that it's a common disorder, neonatal meningitis. The mortality and morbidity is high. Early aggressive intervention is essential. It's a clinical diagnosis. And you must approach the whole problem by a multidisciplinary team, including neonatologist, as well as the neurologist, neurosurgeon, infectious diseases consultant. And of course, after the baby survives, goes out, you have to have developmental pediatrician, and you have to have other colleagues to help you to follow up for the long-term morbidity. Thank you very much. And this is my most favorite slide because I always keep on telling NICU is a teamwork. So thank you very much. So everywhere I say this, NICU is not a one-man show. NICU care is a teamwork, and we're all a part of the team. Everybody is important, particularly the nurses. They are a key and a backbone to the care in the NICU. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you all for it.